Right now, if a doctor hands you a pill that, perfectly extinguishes your chronic pain, there is actually a biological trap waiting inside your cells that essentially guarantees that same pill will, well, eventually stop working. Welcome to today's deep dive. We have an absolutely massive stack of sources on the table for you today, and I mean a literal mountain of data.
Oh, yeah, it is a formidable stack of research.
Right. I mean, we are looking at sweeping clinical guidelines.
Mm.
We have psychiatric umbrella reviews, deep dive articles from the New England Journal of Medicine, and some incredibly dense neurological studies that focus just purely on cellular biology.
And when you lay it all out together, it really points toward a singular, profound misunderstanding in modern medicine.
Yeah, and that's basically our mission today. We want to deconstruct what we are calling the biological trap of opioid stigma.
Hmm.
Because the cultural narrative, like the one you see on the news and documentaries, maybe even from your own family members, right?
Yeah.
It often dismisses chronic pain patients who rely on opioids.
Right, it completely minimizes them.
Exactly. It frames them as victims of some sort of moral failure. Like the cultural assumption is that they just lack willpower or that they're making this series of really poor choices. But the clinical reality hidden in the sources you've shared with us, I mean, it reveals a completely different story.
It really does.
It reveals this fascinating, entirely invisible war happening at the literal cellular level. We are talking about neuroplasticity, central sensitization, and actual structural physical changes to the human brain.
Which is something that honestly touches almost everyone. Even if you aren't personally navigating this right now, the statistics we found in the literature are just staggering.
Oh, absolutely. Roughly 1 in 5 adults deals with chronic pain. I mean, think about that for a second. 1 in
It's
5.
a massive portion of the population.
Yeah, like the next time you are sitting in a crowded coffee shop, just look around. 1 out of every 5 people in that room is fighting this invisible, exhausting battle. So whether you are dealing with chronic pain yourself, or maybe you're trying to support a loved one who is in the thick of it, or you are just insanely curious about how the human brain wires and, oh, well, actively miswires itself, you really need to understand this.
Because moving from viewing pain as just a mere symptom to recognizing it as a primary disease in its own right, it changes absolutely everything.
It really does. It changes how we view human suffering, and frankly, it severely indicts how our medical system responds to it.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have a lot of ground to cover.
We do. And to understand the biological trap of opioids, we first have to understand the biological trap of pain itself. We really need to look at the very foundation of this trap and, well, redefine what pain actually is.
Right.
Because we're moving far away from the traditional idea that pain is simply a signal from an injury. Like the classic example, right? If I accidentally place my hand on a hot stove, my nervous system sends a lightning-fast signal to my brain screaming, ah, hot, move your hand. I mean, that is acute pain.
Exactly. Acute pain is a vital evolutionary survival mechanism.
Right. It keeps us alive.
It's a biological warning system telling you that tissue damage is actively occurring or is about to occur. It's honestly the fundamental reason we survive childhood. You learn not to touch the fire.
Yeah, or you learn to favor a sprained ankle so the ligaments can actually repair themselves.
Right. But the literature draws a hard, definitive line between that acute survival mechanism and chronic pain. Clinically speaking, chronic pain is defined as pain that persists or recurs for more than 3 months. Or, and this is the crucial part, is pain that continues long past the point of normal tissue healing.
And that's the part that is so hard to wrap the mind around. I mean, the tissue is healed, the surgeon's incision is completely closed up, the fractured bone is fully knit back together, but the pain is still just broadcasting.
Right. And this is where the neurological studies in our stack introduce the concept of central sensitization.
Okay, central sensitization.
Yeah. What these papers make incredibly clear is that chronic pain is an expression of neuronal plasticity. Now, we usually talk about neuroplasticity as a universally positive thing, right?
Right, like learning a new skill.
Exactly. It's your brain's ability to change and adapt based on your experiences.
Right.
It's how you learn to play the piano or how you recover motor function after a stroke. Your nervous system's plastic. It molds itself.
But in the case of chronic pain, from what I'm reading, that plasticity turns malignant.
It becomes pathologically hypersensitive. The nervous system literally learns to feel pain, and unfortunately, it becomes terrifyingly efficient at it.
Okay, I need to visualize this because the sources get really deep into the biochemistry of how this actually happens. They talk about glutamate-activated NMDA receptors.
Yes.
Let's slow down the science here for a second. What is actually happening in my spinal cord if I'm developing chronic pain?
Right, let's unpack the mechanics of it. When your body experiences severe or prolonged acute pain, say you have a catastrophic back injury, there's an overwhelming sensory inflow, a massive bombardment of signals traveling up into the spinal cord.
Okay.
This triggers an immediate phase of central sensitization. Glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter, just floods the synaptic clefts. Think of glutamate as a chemical messenger screaming, Pedrer, pay attention to this.
What
Look
the?
at me. Exactly. And this glutamate activates those NMDA receptors we mentioned.
So these NMDA receptors, they are like the gatekeepers on the receiving end of the signal.
They are. And normally, under everyday conditions, these NMDA receptors are very tightly regulated. They only open up for a tiny fraction of a second to pass the signal along, and then they immediately close.
Got it.
But under this intense, sustained bombardment of pain signals, they become phosphorylated.
I saw that word a lot in the research. Phosphorylated. What does adding a phosphate group physically do to a receptor in my body?
It fundamentally changes the receptor's behavior. Adding that phosphate group alters the electrical charge and the physical shape of the receptor protein itself. And this phosphorylation does two really devastating things.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, it makes the receptors hyper-responsive to glutamate, so they stay open much, much longer than they should, and they fire much more easily.
Oh, wow.
And second, it actually increases the total number of NMDA receptors present at the synaptic membrane.
Wait, so the body literally builds more keyholes for the pain signals to enter?
Yes, exactly. It actively recruits more receptors to the surface of the cell. This heightened cellular excitability leads to a phenomenon documented in the sources called wind-up pain.
Wind-up pain.
Yeah, this is where a continuous low-level stimulus and something that maybe originally felt like a 2 out of 10 on the pain scale suddenly starts compounding. And it's essentially perceived as highly, highly painful.
The sources also mentioned allodynia and hyperalgesia as the clinical outcomes of this whole process.
Yes, those are the main clinical signs. Allodynia is when something that shouldn't hurt at all suddenly causes genuine agony.
Yeah.
We're talking about a light touch on the arm, the feeling of a bed sheet resting against your legs, or even just a cool breeze.
The breeze.
Yeah, the nervous system completely misinterprets non-painful sensory input as dangerous. And hyperalgesia is a slightly different manifestation. It's an exaggerated, extreme response to a normally mildly painful stimulus.
Like a paper cut or something.
Exactly. If you get a tiny paper cut, your brain registers it as if your finger was just severed.
Jeez. It makes me think of a car alarm system. You know when someone's car alarm gets stuck in the on position in the middle of the night?
Oh, yeah. The worst.
Right. So initially the alarm goes off because someone actually bumped the bumper. That's the acute injury. It's working as intended. But then the electrical system is completely sensitized. The wiring goes haywire. And like an hour later, literally just a leaf falling on the windshield triggers a blaring neighborhood waking siren.
That is a perfect analogy. The system itself is fundamentally broken.
But I have to ask, because from a purely biological evolutionary standpoint, that makes zero sense to me. If the pain is no longer protecting the body from a hot stove or a broken bone, why would our bodies be designed to torture us after the danger has passed?
The short answer is there isn't an evolutionary benefit.
Really?
No. It is a malfunction of an otherwise brilliant system. It is the absolute dark side of that neuroplastic adaptability. And if we look even closer at the cellular level from the texts, we see specific proteins involved in making this permanent, like PSD95 and atypical protein kinase C.
Ah, the scaffolding proteins?
Scaffolding is the perfect word for them. These proteins literally connect these hyperactive, newly formed NMDA receptors to the cytoskeleton, the internal structural framework of the neuron.
Wow.
They anchor them in place.
Hold on. So this isn't just a chemical imbalance. It's not just a temporary flood of neurotransmitters that can, eventually be washed away. You're saying it is structurally built into the nervous system, like laying rebar in concrete.
It is physically encoded in the spinal cord and the dorsal horn. And the later phases of this central sensitization actually involve the activation of transcription factors.
What does that mean practically?
It means the chronic pain signal reaches all the way into the nucleus of the cell and alters gene expression. It changes the long-lasting fundamental function of those neurons.
That completely obliterates the cultural narrative that chronic pain is just all in the patient's head, or some psychological inability to, move on from an injury.
It proves definitively that chronic pain is a distinct, measurable, physiological disease state. The nervous system has structurally transformed.
Okay, so if the body is locking itself into this hypersensitive state, literally building physical scaffolding to ensure it keeps feeling pain, the immediate question is, how do we break the lock?
Right.
Historically, modern medicine's absolute skeleton key for pain has been opioids. But looking at the New England Journal of Medicine data we have here, it seems like that key is picking the wrong doors. Which kind of leads us to the paradox of how opioids simultaneously heal and hijack the brain.
Yeah, to understand why opioids create such a dangerous biological trap of their own, we really have to look at the pharmacology mapped out in that New England Journal of Medicine article. Opioids exert their effects predominantly by binding to mu-opioid receptors.
And those are distributed throughout the brain and the body, right?
They are.
Okay, so the mu-opioid receptors are the specific keyholes, and the opioid medication, whether it's oxycodone, morphine, or hydrocodone, is the key.
Precisely. And the physical location of these keyholes inside your brain is everything. The NEJM maps this out beautifully. Mu-opioid receptors are incredibly dense in the specific brain regions that regulate pain perception. We are talking about the periaqueductal gray, the thalamus, the insula, and the anterior cingulate cortex.
A lot of big words, but basically the pain centers.
Yes. When the opioid binds to the receptors in these specific areas, it effectively blocks the transmission of pain signals. It produces profound analgesia. The pain is just silenced.
Which is exactly what you want when you are trapped in the agony of central sensitization.
But here is the crux of the paradox. Those exact same mu-opioid receptors, the identical keyholes, are also densely concentrated in the brain's emotional and reward regions.
The amygdala.
The amygdala, yes,
Yeah.
which processes our emotional reactivity to pain and fear, and the ventral tegmental area, along with the nucleus accumbens. These areas are the absolute core of the human brain's reward circuitry.
Yeah.
They govern our perception of pleasure, our motivation, and our deep sense of well-being.
So a single pill hits both of those distinct neural systems simultaneously. Here's where it gets really interesting, because the way you're describing it, it sounds like trying to extinguish a house fire with a fire hose that sprays both water and gasoline at the exact same time.
That is exactly what it's like.
You are absolutely putting out the flames of the physical pain. The water is working, but you are simultaneously igniting the reward center of the brain with the gasoline. Are we saying it is biologically inevitable that treating severe chronic pain with opioids leads to this neurological hijacking?
Well, it isn't a guarantee for every single patient, but the biological deck is heavily stacked against them. The sources describe a phenomenon known as the Pavlovian trap.
The Pavlovian trap, like the dogs ringing the bell for food.
Exactly like that. Because opioids act on both the pain centers and the reward centers concurrently, they mediate a very powerful learned association. It's classical Pavlovian conditioning, happening deep within the subconscious structures of the brain.
Wow.
The patient, who is suffering immensely, receives the drug. The severe physical pain vanishes, and concurrently, a massive wave of chemically induced euphoria and well-being washes over them.
Right, so the brain connects the pill not just to, I am no longer hurting, but to, I suddenly feel incredibly good.
Right. And when that cycle is repeated over months or even years, it strengthens a deeply ingrained neural pathway. Over time, for a chronic pain patient, even mild levels of pain or even simple emotional distress like stress at work can trigger this learned association.
It becomes a reflex.
Yes. It manifests as a profound conditioned urge for relief. A craving that feels entirely biological, because neurologically speaking, it is biological.
That makes perfect sense from a behavioral standpoint. But you found a cellular connection in the literature that completely blew my mind regarding this paradox.
Oh, this is perhaps the most stunning revelation in all the cellular biology texts we reviewed. The transition from acute pain to chronic pain, that whole process of central sensitization we just discussed, shares the exact same cellular mechanisms as the development of opioid tolerance.
Wait, let me make sure I am hearing you right. The body learning to be in chronic pain uses the exact same machinery as the body learning to resist the painkiller.
The exact same machinery. Both processes involve the upregulation and phosphorylation of those NMDA receptors. Both involve the nitric oxide pathways. Both involve the protein kinase C cascades we talked about.
So the very process of your nervous system becoming chronically sensitized to pain creates a biological environment that is already chemically primed for opioid tolerance.
The disease state of chronic pain literally lays out the red carpet for the opioid drug to lose its effectiveness.
That is devastating. The pain structurally rewires the brain, and that specific rewiring makes the only effective medical treatment stop working as well. which then, I guess, forces the patient to take more of the treatment to get the same relief.
which in turn hits that reward center even harder with the gasoline hose.
It's a completely closed loop of suffering.
And because that biological machinery looks a certain way from the outside, because it results in escalating doses and a desperation for medication, society steps in and judges it.
Which brings us to a massive cultural roadblock we have to dismantle today. We look at this cycle, the patient needing more pills, the fear of running out, the altering of the brain's reward pathways, and our culture has historically viewed these behaviors through a really harsh lens of moral failure.
We constantly conflate complex biology with a lack of character.
We really do. And to dismantle that stigma, the sources insist we rely on strict, rigorous clinical definitions. We have to separate physical dependence, tolerance, and addiction.
Because they are absolutely not the same thing. Yet the public, the media, and shockingly, even some medical professionals use those terms completely interchangeably.
Let's lay them out clearly for the listener. Let's start with tolerance. What is actually happening in the body?
Tolerance is a predictable neuroadaptation. As you take an opioid repeatedly, the body recognizes this external chemical is constantly flooding the system, and it adapts to its presence.
It tries to balance things out.
Exactly. The receptors become less responsive. The cells attempt to maintain their baseline normal. So to get the exact same analgesic effect, the exact same amount of pain relief you got on day one,
Yeah.
you eventually need a higher dose.
Right.
The literature shows that over time, a patient might require up to 10 times their original starting dose just to maintain baseline pain relief.
10 times the dose. And from what I read in the NEJM article, that introduces a terrifying variable regarding the patient's breathing, doesn't it?
It does. You build tolerance to the pain relief and the euphoria very quickly. The brain downregulates those receptors fast. But you build tolerance to the respiratory depression, which is the side effect of the opioid that suppresses the brainstem's drive to breathe much, much more slowly.
So the gap between the dose you need to stop the pain and the dose that makes you stop breathing in your sleep starts to get narrower and narrower.
That narrowing therapeutic window is the primary mechanism of the overdose risk. But the crucial takeaway here is that needing a higher dose to achieve pain relief is a physiological cellular response. It is not addiction.
Okay, so that's tolerance. What about physical dependence? Because if I am physically dependent on a drug, culturally, people would just call me an addict.
And they would be clinically incorrect.
Yeah.
Physical dependence is the physiological adaptation that causes withdrawal when the drug is abruptly stopped or if the dose is drastically reduced too quickly.
Because the body relies on it now.
Right. Again, your body has established a new homeostasis with the drug present in its system. It expects it to be there. If you certainly take it away, the entire nervous system gets thrown into absolute chaos.
The sources list the withdrawal symptoms, and honestly, it sounds like a nightmare.
It is agonizing. The
Mm.
patient experiences piloerection, which is severe goosebumps. Incidentally, that is where the phrase quitting cold turkey comes from, because the skin looks like a plucked turkey.
I had no idea that's where that came from.
Yeah. And they also suffer from profound chills, severe insomnia that can last for days, relentless diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, and intense deep bone and muscle aches.
Wow.
But we must be clear here. Anyone who takes opioids daily for an extended period will become physically dependent. Whether you are a saint or a sinner, your biology will demand the drug. It is a biological guarantee. It is not addiction.
So then we have to answer the hardest question. What is true addiction? Because culturally, we see someone going through that horrific withdrawal, or we see them needing 10 times their original dose. And the assumption is just, look at them. Addiction is just a series of bad choices made by someone who just lacks the willpower to stop.
That is the exact dangerous misconception the NEJM article warns against. Addiction, which is clinically referred to as severe substance use disorder, is a primary, chronic, neurobiologic disease.
A disease.
Yes. It is characterized by impaired control over drug use, obsessive and intrusive thinking about the drug, compulsive drug-taking behavior, and crucially, the defining hallmark, continued use despite harm.
Despite harm. That seems to be the fulcrum of the entire diagnosis.
It is the dividing line. The person with an active addiction will continue to seek and use the drug even when it is actively destroying their interpersonal relationships, bankrupting them, ruining their career, decimating their health, or putting them in immediate, obvious physical danger. Addiction involves long-lasting structural and functional changes in the reward, inhibitory, and emotional circuits of the brain. While the physical chaos of withdrawal from physical dependence might resolve in a few weeks, the brain changes of addiction can persist for months or even years after the drug is completely out of the system.
And the sources show that addiction isn't just about some moral failing or lack of willpower, it's heavily genetic.
The clinical studies are absolutely definitive on this point. The vulnerability to developing an opioid addiction is heavily genetically modulated, with a heritability rate ranging from 35 to 40%.
So it's inherited, much like the genetic risk for asthma or type 2 diabetes or hypertension.
Exactly like those chronic diseases. Furthermore, the age of exposure plays a massive role in the vulnerability. Adolescents are at a significantly higher risk because their frontal cortices, the
Right.
part of the brain responsible for executive function, self-control, and evaluating long-term consequences, are fundamentally underdeveloped.
While their reward centers are basically fully online.
Right, their reward centers are highly neuroplastic and sensitive. The biology is primed for addiction if the drug is introduced at that age.
So we have tolerance, dependence, and addiction clearly defined. But there was a fourth term introduced in these papers that stopped me in my tracks. Pseudo-addiction. What exactly is that?
Pseudo-addiction is a vital, life-saving concept for clinicians to understand. It describes a patient who is displaying behaviors that look exactly, identically like addiction to an untrained observer.
Like what kind of behaviors?
This patient might be clock watching, literally counting down the minutes until they are allowed to take their next pill. They might aggressively and angrily complain to the doctor about needing higher doses. They might hoard medications just in case, or harass the medical office staff for early refills.
Wait, if I'm a doctor or just a family member watching this happen, that looks entirely like drug-seeking behavior. It looks like an addict who is desperate for a fix. How could you possibly distinguish that from actual addiction? They look exactly the same to me.
They do look identical on the surface, but the underlying cause is entirely different. A patient with pseudo-addiction is doing these things not because they have the neurobiologic disease of addiction, but because their severe chronic pain is being vastly undertreated.
Ah.
The dose they are currently on just isn't working. They are desperate for relief from genuine, crushing physical agony.
Okay, but how do you test for that clinically? How do you prove it's pseudo-addiction and not a substance use disorder?
The diagnostic test is actually quite simple.
Huh?
You provide adequate pain management.
You just give them more.
Yes. If the clinician increases the dose of the opioid or successfully implements a different, highly effective pain management strategy, and the patient's pain is finally relieved, the addictive behaviors vanish entirely.
Just like that.
A true addict, given a higher dose, will take that higher dose and still exhibit compulsive, out-of-control drug-seeking behavior because the reward center is driving the bus.
Right, because it's not about the pain anymore.
Exactly. Yeah. But a patient with pseudo-addiction gets the relief they needed, their nervous system stabilizes, and they calmly go back to living their life. The hoarding stops. The clock watching stops.
That is a staggering clinical distinction. And the stakes are incredibly high because if a doctor gets it wrong, if they look at an undertreated pain patient and mislabel them as an addict, they end up treating a suffering person like a criminal.
They cut off their medication entirely.
Which leads to this stark statistic from the texts. When researchers looked at carefully diagnosed, true addiction rates in chronic pain patient populations, it hovers around 8%. Just 8%.
It's remarkably low compared to what people think.
But the rates of what they call aberrant behaviors, which bundles in things like pseudo-addiction and tolerance-driven dose escalation, those range from 15 to 26%. So the cultural stigma of the opioid crisis is taking that entire 15 to 26% block, labeling them all as moral failures and addicts, when true addiction is only a fraction of that.
And that profound mislabeling, that societal stigma, carries an immense psychological cost for the patient, which really brings us to the collateral damage of being caught in this biological trap.
Yeah, what does this constant judgment and biological warfare actually do to a person's mind? If your nervous system is actively reshaping itself to feel more pain, and the primary treatment you rely on carries all this heavy neurological risk and societal baggage, what is happening to your mental health?
It's devastating.
Because the sources show a terrifying bidirectional relationship between chronic pain and psychological trauma.
It is a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle. The literature confirms that chronic pain causes mental health disorders, and conversely, mental health disorders severely amplify chronic pain.
It goes both ways.
To truly grasp the massive scale of this overlap, we have to look closely at the umbrella review conducted by Stubbs and his colleagues.
Let's linger on the study because the methodology alone is mind-blowing.
This was not a small, localized clinical trial. They synthesized data across an astonishing 957,000 people diagnosed with mental disorders.
Almost a million people.
And they compared them against over 16 million control subjects.
16 million controls. That is population-level data. You simply cannot argue with statistical power that massive. And the prevalence rates they found regarding pain and mental health are just horrifying.
They paint a very grim picture. Let's look specifically at post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. The prevalence of chronic pain in individuals diagnosed with PTSD ranged from 66% to an astonishing 96%.
Wait, 96%. That means almost every single person in that cohort who is living with severe, debilitating psychological trauma is also living with chronic, unrelenting physical pain.
Yes.
How is that even biologically possible?
It highlights how deeply intertwined our emotional and physical nervous systems are. For major depressive disorder, the prevalence sits between 53% and 65%.
More than half.
For individuals navigating bipolar disorder, the relative risk of having chronic pain is 2.14 compared to the general population. That means they are more than twice as likely to suffer from chronic pain conditions.
That's unbelievable.
And the risk works both ways. Having clinical depression increases your risk of developing chronic regional pain by about 26%. Having multi-site chronic pain increases your risk of developing depression by a staggering 88%.
So what does this actually mean mechanically inside the brain? Why are trauma and physical pain sharing the same neural real estate?
If I can try an analogy here, it feels like the pain signal is a guitar string being plucked. The physical injury vibrates the string, but depression or trauma acts like the amplifier that the guitar is plugged into. If you are depressed, the amplifier is cranked to maximum volume. The string is vibrating the exact same amount, but the sound, the pain you experience, is deafening. Does the pain actually physically hurt more if you are depressed?
That is an excellent way to visualize it, and the answer is absolutely yes. It does physically hurt more. And the neurological studies explain the specific circuitry behind this amplifier. The medial prefrontal cortex is a region of the brain heavily involved in processing the cognitive and emotional aspects of pain stimuli.
But it is also a critical component of the mesocortical limbic circuitry.
That's a massive term. Break that down for us.
The mesocortical limbic circuitry is essentially the brain's reward and emotional regulation system. It is the exact same network of pathways heavily implicated in major depressive disorder and substance use disorder.
So it's all wired together.
Exactly. When a patient develops chronic pain, the functional connectivity between the medial prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens, a key reward center, fundamentally changes. The physical pain signal from the spinal cord is being routed directly through a depressed or anxious emotional filter. Wow. A patient with depression typically displays heightened pain sensitivity. Their biological threshold for pain is literally lowered. The pain genuinely hurts more because the brain's endogenous emotional dampening system, the mechanism that usually turns down the amplifier, is compromised by the depression.
Okay, let's put this in a real-world context. If a patient walks into a primary care clinic presenting with major depressive disorder and severe chronic lower back pain, are our doctors actually equipped to treat both of those intertwined systems simultaneously? Or do they force the patient to pick a lane, like, are you here for your back or are you here for your mood?
That is one of the most critical questions we can ask about modern healthcare, and the literature indicates that the medical system fails these patients routinely.
That's so sad.
Medicine has become highly siloed. You have pain management specialists focusing entirely on the body, and you have psychiatrists focusing entirely on the mind. The texts explicitly note that general physicians often lack the cross-disciplinary training required to manage these deeply complex bidirectional comorbidities.
Right, because they're just trying to get through a 15-minute appointment.
Exactly. And what frequently happens is a clinical phenomenon called diagnostic overshadowing.
Diagnostic overshadowing, meaning one diagnosis casts a shadow over the other, effectively hiding it from the doctor.
Yes. A physician might look at a patient's history of severe depression or trauma and immediately assume their physical pain is just a somatic manifestation of their sadness. They write it off as it's all in your head, and they completely fail to treat the actual physical neuroplastic disease, the central sensitization happening in the patient's spinal cord.
They just brush it off.
Or it happens the other way around. A doctor focuses so entirely on the structural back issue, ordering endless x-rays and MRIs, that they completely ignore the severe untreated depression that is biochemically amplifying the pain signal.
So the patient is left stranded in the middle, fully treated for neither condition.
And the sources note that patients with chronic pain, accompanied by psychological complications, are actively discriminated against in the healthcare system. They are often a coded low priority. They were labeled in their charts as difficult, complex, or non-compliant.
Which brings us to the ultimate tragedy of this deep dive. When you take this incredibly complex, bidirectional neuroplastic disease and you drop it into a medical system that is terrified of the opioid epidemic, the results are catastrophic.
The pendulum of medical consensus swung violently from one extreme to the other. For years, as we know, the system relied heavily on opioids.
Right.
This was driven by the belief that all pain must be entirely eradicated, but it was coupled with a profound lack of understanding of the long-term biological trap we just discussed. This over-reliance, which was fueled by various factors including highly aggressive pharmaceutical marketing and liberal prescribing practices, undoubtedly contributed to a horrific, devastating epidemic of addiction and overdose deaths.
Right, the opioid crisis.
The reaction to that epidemic from regulatory bodies was entirely necessary, but the execution caused immense, unforgivable collateral damage to legitimate pain patients.
Right, the clinical guidelines. The sources spend a lot of time analyzing the impact of guidelines, specifically the CDC's 2016 recommendations on opioid prescribing. Now, I'm reading the summary of these guidelines, and they seem well-intentioned.
They were.
They were meant to curb the overdose rates, but what actually happened on the ground in the doctor's offices when these were released?
The intention was caution. The guidelines emphasized limiting opioid prescriptions to the lowest effective dose for the shortest possible duration, and they strongly suggested preferring non-opioid therapies.
Makes sense on paper.
But in practice, this created a massive system-wide chilling effect. General practitioners, who manage the vast majority of chronic pain cases in this country, became terrified to prescribe opioids at all.
Because they didn't want to get in trouble.
Exactly. The scrutiny from state medical boards, insurance companies, pharmacy chains, and even law enforcement became incredibly intense. So doctors began rapidly tapering or abruptly cutting off opioid prescriptions entirely.
Just stopping them.
And they did this even for legitimate, stable, chronic pain patients who had been on the same effective dose for 10 years without ever exhibiting a single sign of true addiction.
So we took a complex, multidisciplinary disease, chronic pain, and for decades we treated it with a singular magic bullet: opioids. When we finally realized that bullet was ricocheting and causing a massive public health crisis, we took the bullet away from everyone, but we didn't replace it with anything.
That is an incredibly apt summary of the current crisis. General practitioners report feeling entirely overwhelmed. The clinician handbook source we reviewed notes that primary care doctors feel pressured, frustrated, ungratified, and guilty when dealing with chronic pain patients.
Guilty because they can't help.
Yes, they are told by the guidelines to use non-pharmacological multidisciplinary approaches, things like cognitive behavioral therapy, intensive physical therapy, acupuncture, and alternative pain management clinics.
Which sounds great.
It does. But the reality on the ground is that these resources are often entirely unavailable in rural areas. They're routinely not covered by health insurance, or they're prohibitively expensive for a patient who might be out of work due to their pain. The doctor is left with literally nothing to offer the suffering patient but a sympathetic nod.
And it gets even darker when you look at the demographics of who is being denied care in this triage system. The disparities highlighted in the sources are enraging. They show a clear systemic bias.
The data is a profound indictment of the system. Studies show that Hispanic and Asian patients receiving emergency medical services treatment are significantly less likely to even receive a basic pain assessment compared to white patients.
They don't even assess the pain?
No. Nationally, people of color are less likely to be prescribed pain medication for the exact same injuries, less likely to have their self-reported pain scores taken seriously, and less likely to feel heard or respected by their clinicians.
They are just assumed to be drug-seeking rather than pain-relieving. The moral failing myth we discussed earlier is being actively weaponized through a lens of racial bias.
It is an inescapable conclusion from the data. And the ultimate unmet need, the final devastating statistic that underscores this entire systemic failure, is the suicide rate among chronic pain patients.
This is the part that just broke my heart reading through the notes.
The texts show that the lifetime prevalence of suicide attempts in people living with chronic pain ranges from 5% to 14%.
14%.
Having chronic pain is estimated to double the risk of death by suicide. When a patient is biologically trapped by a nervous system stuck on high alert, physically dependent on a medication they can no longer access because their doctor is afraid of losing their license, viewed as a moral failure by society, and completely abandoned by a terrified medical system, the hopelessness becomes terminal.
That is incredibly heavy. To think that we have created a system where the pain is so inescapable and the help is so completely cut off that up to 14% of these patients attempt to take their own lives. So, where do we go from here? What do these sources actually advocate for if opioids are biologically dangerous, but abandoning patients is literally lethal?
The consensus across the clinical guidelines, the International Association for the Study of Pain statements, and the latest research is a desperate call for individualized, patient-centered, multidisciplinary care.
We have to change the whole model.
It requires a complete paradigm shift in medicine. We must recognize chronic pain as a primary complex disease of the nervous system, not just a symptom of an old injury. The solution isn't simply prescribe more opioids or enforce zero opioids. It's utilizing a broad spectrum of funded care.
Funded being the key word.
Absolutely. The data on non-pharmacological treatments like mindfulness-based stress reduction or cognitive behavioral therapy shows that while they might only have a small statistical effect on reducing the raw intensity of the physical pain, they have a large and vital effect on reducing pain interference.
Meaning the physical pain level might still be a 6 out of 10, but the patient develops the neurological and psychological tools to actually get their life back. They can function despite the pain.
Precisely. But achieving that requires time, comprehensive clinical assessment, actively dismantling the silos between physical and mental health care, and crucially, actual funding and political will. It requires supporting clinicians with resources so they can actually support their patients.
Let's try to synthesize this massive journey we've been on today. We started by looking at chronic pain not as a lingering ache from a past injury, but as a physical structural rewiring of the nervous system central sensitization, right? Where NMDA receptors literally build scaffolding to lock the brain into a permanent alarm state.
Yes, the car alarm stuck on.
Right. And then we explored how opioids inadvertently lay a biological trap by targeting both the pain relief and the reward centers of the brain simultaneously, paving the way for tolerance using the exact same cellular mechanisms that cause the pain in the first place.
The shared machinery. We then dismantled the cultural stigma, separating the physiological inevitability of tolerance and physical dependence from this severe neurobiological disease of true addiction.
And we highlighted the tragic reality of pseudo-addiction, where undertreated pain mimics drug-seeking behavior. We explored the bidirectional nightmare of mental health comorbidities, demonstrating how depression and trauma actively amplify physical pain through shared brain circuitry.
And finally, we looked at a medical system in triage, where an institutional overcorrection to the opioid epidemic, driven by guidelines and fear, has left legitimate, marginalized pain patients completely abandoned in a sea of untreated physical and mental anguish.
It is a staggering amount of information to process.
It is a heavy topic, but knowledge is the absolute prerequisite for empathy. Understanding the strict biological difference between tolerance, dependence, and addiction can fundamentally change how you interact with a loved one who is dealing with chronic pain or a substance use disorder. When you understand the cellular reality, it entirely removes the judgment.
It does. It shifts the internal narrative from, why aren't you trying harder to get better, to, how can we help your nervous system heal? Which brings us to a final, lingering thought for you to chew on, based on everything we've read in these sources regarding neuroplasticity.
If chronic pain is essentially a learned neural pathway, the brain physically learning to feel pain, even when the tissue is healed through structural protein changes at the synapse, and if addiction is also a learned maladaptive neural pathway locked into the reward center, could the future of medicine lie not in discovering a new pill to numb the signals?
What if the ultimate cure for chronic pain isn't a drug that acts as a chemical wet blanket on the nervous system, but finding a way to help the brain actively unlearn these pathways entirely? What if the future of treating chronic pain is a profound structural neurological reboot?
It is the absolute frontier of neuroplasticity research.
Yeah.
If the brain can wire itself into this biological trap, perhaps with the right scientific breakthroughs, we can discover how to help it wire its way out.
It makes you look at that traditional X-ray very differently. The broken bone is easy, it's visible, it's clean. But the invisible suffering, the silent rewiring of the human nervous system, that's the real frontier. And it demands not just our scientific curiosity, but our absolute unyielding compassion. Until next time, thanks for taking the deep dive with us.